Now, let's resume our afternoon program. The title of the fifth session is Perennial Conflict: How do we deal with the three fronts of Ukraine, the Middle East, and Asia? We have 5 excellent panelists with us here and online. From your left, we have here with us Professor Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, a member of the executive board of Bertelsmann Stiftung. Mr. Alex Gray, CEO at American Global Strategies and former chief of staff of the White House National Security Council. Welcome back, Mr. Gray. We also have Mr. Koichi Nakagawa, Adjunct Fellow here at JIIA. Mr. Bill Emmott, Chairman of the Trustees at the Institute for International Strategic Studies, is joining with us online. A warm welcome to Chairman Emmott. Professor Takako Hikotani from Gakushuin University will be the moderator for this session. Professor Hikotani, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Good afternoon. Welcome to the session, the first session of the part 3 of this symposium, Ukraine and Middle East, Advent of an Era of Perennial Conflict. And today, the topic of this session is perennial conflict. How do we deal with the three fronts of Ukraine, Middle East, and Asia? One day after the Hamas attack, a U.S. official said, Russia-Ukraine and Israeli-Palestine conflicts has the potential to be a global shifting wars like World War I and World War II, which reflected and produced major changes in the international order. And she also claimed that the Hamas attack in Israel was a kind of a Pearl Harbor moment. It opened a second front. I believe the topic of three fronts is very much in people's minds these days, and it is also mentioned in the chapter 1 of the Strategic Annual Report 2023, which we heard about yesterday. So we have 4 experts from 4 regions, but instead of going over the 3 fronts times 4 countries, I'd like to talk more about the interplay of the fronts in the session. Because Professor Milone in the previous session talked about how the old order is over and a new order is yet to emerge. And also, Mr. Gray, in earlier session today, you talked about how these issues and fronts cannot actually be compartmentalized. So I'd like to talk about that and about how the three fronts relate to one another. And as to the end, we would like to talk about how, as Prime Minister Kishida often said, Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. And with that, I'd like to talk about the organization of this panel. First, I'd like to ask each speakers to speak for about 5 minutes. And I have already asked you the question that I'll be asking, which is, what would be the greatest challenge in 2024 in dealing with the three fronts? And then after that, we'll have some discussion among the experts on the panel. But finally, I'd like to make sure that we leave some time for audience Q&A. And we are already accepting some questions from the online audience. So for all the listeners online, please start thinking about your questions and submit them as you listen to our panel. But I would like to also encourage the audience here to raise your hand and ask questions. So please, I hope that this will be a more engaging discussion. It is a challenge to cover everything, but I like to do my best to make the discussion as wide and lively as possible. So first, I'd like to ask Dr. Schwarzer to start with the 5-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on this panel, and thank you for your kind introduction. I'll pick up your question, what are the major challenges this year at the intersection of 3 crises? I'll try to make 4 points in 5 minutes, and I hope this works out. So let me first say that I increasingly observe when working with policymakers, both in Berlin but also in Europe, that the sheer need of crisis management and the engagement, the trips, the diplomatic efforts to prevent war, of course, and to contain wars where they already are so that they don't spread, this is already extremely challenging. The sheer woman and manpower that is available for this multiplicity of parallel events, it very often comes to the same people who engage on the different conflicts, and that is challenging. Because when you look at it from a European perspective, you don't only engage with the region, but you also engage with your European peers to coordinate as much as possible. And we have seen over the past weeks that this has not always worked. So Europe has this extra challenge of presenting itself as united as possible, should ideally speak with one single voice. So we have an internal challenge as well. The second point is obviously costs. Costs for sustaining Ukraine in military terms, in civilian terms, humanitarian aid, the efforts to step up support to Israel and the Gaza Strip, also in terms of humanitarian aid, diplomatic efforts, and Israel also in some ways militarily. There is a cost, and right now the major question for Europe, and this is very much the question of this year, is where the US will go in their support, firstly for Ukraine, but then secondly in their ask to Europeans to step up their own efforts in Asia. So there are two dimensions to this. For Ukraine, the very simple question is, in terms of procurement, will there be a possibility to support Ukraine with what it needs as quickly as it needs? There are, big question marks already now, and the situation will worsen in the year 2024 when it comes to ammunition. We have a very hot debate on mid and long range missiles at the moment. So this is really a big issue. And the situation currently for Germany is complicated because it covers about 50% of all provisions and given commitments of the EU. And so there is a feeling that Germany has reached a limit and that it needs European partners to step up in the possible case that the US doesn't pass a next support package before the elections through Congress, and that afterwards, in the case of a Trump scenario, there will be less support. So my third point will be on order. I think we heard since the opening panel yesterday the Japanese perspective on why the evolution of the support for Ukraine and how this war is settled matters a lot, very much beyond the European continent. And I think the major issue that we have to take away from this conflict, and it will have repercussions on the evolution in other world regions, and not only the three, but possibly also in Africa and Latin America, is whether an aggressor is contained in the attempt to seize territory, to breach the national sovereignty of a country, and to intervene heavily in national affairs of Ukraine. So the question how the international community reacts here will be interpreted with regards to other conflicts. My fourth point, and I've already spoken about it, is of course the role of the United States, but I will go beyond the question of support for Ukraine here. From a European perspective, it is essential how the US elections position the United States with regards to its global responsibility in the future, its engagement in Europe. There is a big question mark with regards to the continuous US engagement in the EU's neighborhood. This question is old. We heard about the pivot to Asia, which was more announced than actual. We have seen over the past 2 years a return of US engagement and a strengthening of NATO on the European continent. But there is a growing sense of Europeans that we will have to take more control and more support of our own security in our own neighborhood. And this is not just with regards to the conflict between or Russia's aggression on Ukraine, but it is really about rebuilding a European security order, which, if the war continues, if Russia does not change its position, will be a European security order against Russia, and not, as previously thought, in some way with Russia. My final point concerns the reactions to wars where we have learned a lot over the past 2 years. First of all, that actors, for instance, from the global south, look at the political West's reaction to Russia's aggression on Ukraine in a very critical way, accusing Europe and the US of double standards, of not acknowledging other wars with equally bad repercussions. And we now see, and I'll come to the end with that, also how the situation in Israel and the Gaza Strip divides the global community of countries, and how critically, in particular, first reactions, which were mostly in solidarity with Israel, and strongly so, for instance, from the German perspective, how this was seen as very critical, and how the question of the adequacy of reaction, the protection of civilians, came very strongly as an issue, in particular from the Muslim world. So in addition to managing the response to the three crises, there is a task of managing the conversation in the global community beyond the parties involved, how to deal with the standards and how to reach, I would say, less division and less conflict, but really a more integrated approach to handling the three crises at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to ask Mr. Emmott to join.
Thank you very, very much, Hikotani Sensei, for introducing me, and also thank you to the JIIA for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I really wish I was in Tokyo as well, but I was unable to join you, but thank you for allowing me to join online. From my point of view, which is, of course, a European point of view, but someone sitting in Europe, but also with very much a global set of interests, the biggest challenge for 2024 can be quite simply described. It is making sure that Ukraine does not lose its war, making sure that Ukraine is able to remain a sovereign country, making sure that Russia does not win this war. The war in Ukraine is in a critical state. There is the potential for major Russian gains this year if Ukraine is not able to receive the weapons and support that it needs. And if Ukraine were to actually be defeated or to lose back major areas of its territory, I think the precedent and encouragement that this would set for other conflicts in the world, by which I really mean the issue over Taiwan, would be terrible and devastating. So it's as critical as that. I think that the principal issue is one of absolutely guaranteeing that this war is not lost, and hopefully that it is actually won, and that all other kind of planning issues and like technical issues are a distraction away from that really central question. Europe is by far the biggest supporter of Ukraine in financial and military terms, but clearly Ukraine is on Europe's territory. Europe definitely needs to do more. As Daniela Schwarzer said, the big issues are about unifying our response and also mobilizing our resources. I do think the long-term implication of solving this challenge for 2024 has to be the credible demonstration that the West is able and willing to mobilize its resources in a credible way to act as a deterrent against countries that wish to change the international order, change the sovereignty of nations, change territory by force. The key issue in deterrence is credibility and political will. Without demonstration that we are able to mobilize our production resources, but also the actual spending on armed forces in our countries, all statements and position papers on deterrence, including all position papers on tilts to the Indo-Pacific or having reviews and strategies towards the Indo-Pacific are simply not credible. So the long-term challenge in 2024 is to build our credibility as a deterrent force against other conflicts that could, of course, break out in the world. We do need, I think, thirdly, my final point, we need to remember the lessons of the Cold War. We're not in a second Cold War in any broad sense with regard to China, but where we are in is that we are in a position in which conventional war could break out between the West and China. We are so far resisting a direct conventional conflict between the West and Russia. This week's controversy over President Macron's rather loose comment about perhaps sending ground troops into Ukraine to assist with some aspects showed the great sensitivity of any idea of NATO forces going into a conventional war directly with Russia. Why is this sensitive? Because during the Cold War, although we had many proxy wars around the world, there was no direct conflict, conventional conflict between the US and the Soviet Union because of the perception that it would inevitably bring in nuclear weapons. I think the reality of the situation in Asia is that unless our conventional deterrence is credible, then nuclear weapons would inevitably come into play as a deterrent against conflict around Taiwan. And the key part of our deterrence is the credibility of our pledges to support Taiwan in the case of an invasion. What happens in Ukraine will be critical for that credibility. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to ask our Middle East specialist on the panel, Mr. Nakagawa, please.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. And it is a great pleasure and honor to be able to on the stage today. Though I am Japanese, today I understand my role, my mission is to represent of the Middle Eastern countries. Middle Eastern countries is very wide, from Israel to Saudi Arabia, Turkey. But it's impossible to deal with all countries. So that's why I'd like to deal with 3 important countries, especially for US policies. And firstly, the Saudi Arabia. Actually, I served in Ministry for Affairs for more than 20 years. My first career is started from Palestinians and Israelis and Gaza, actually. I served in Gaza and I studied Arabic. So I had a lot of chance to interpret with former PLO chairman Yasser Arafat. So this is that's why maybe I'll be able to represent from their point. And Israel, Saudi Arabia, and then Iran. 3 those important points is and very especially this year 24 and after the election and that U.S. policy toward those countries really changeable. So firstly, Saudi Arabia. Actually, I'm currently a business consultant and every month to the business trip to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The relationship between Washington and Riyadh is currently very, wavering because of the Biden's policy toward the, Gulf countries, especially they are very, emphasizing on the human rights and democracies. That's why when Biden's the first trip to the Riyadh, 2022 July, Biden met Mohammed bin Salman. At that time, he didn't consider him as a counterpart of the US president, but actually he had to meet him because of the oil soaring, because after the Russians' aggression to Ukraine. So, but human rights, especially Saudi Arabia's journalist Khashoggi, most probably they don't know, but it's very important to regarding US-Saudi's relationship, human rights, democracies. So that's why they had to raise up these issues in the beginning of the meeting at the time. Though US wanted to get more oil from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. This is kind of the dilemma, between the democracies, human rights, and also the solid relationship. This is, I have to say, this race, and also Israel. Israel also, between Biden's administrations and Netanyahu's administration, usually democratic parties, they have to pursue the peace process, in the Middle East. But this is, contrast to the what Netanyahu wants to do. So, in principle, the relationship between democratic administration U.S. and Netanyahu is, very much tensioning. But contrast to the Trump, maybe you remember, Trump Netanyahu's relationship was highest. Not, of course, I cannot say full score, but the best relationship at that time. So what will happen, and maybe Netanyahu, and actually Mohammed bin Salman also, I heard from some Saudis people, they are now waiting for the change in the administration for US. Thirdly, Iran, regarding the campaign of Biden's administration, on the condition, of course, but Biden administration would like to be back to the JCPOA, Iranian nuclear agreement. But after 3 years have passed, nothing happened. And already, House representative is majority of the Republicans. So through this year, it will not happen, back to JCPOA from US side. Those three countries, very important, I think. So we have to discuss. But finally, I have to say, because my task is to represent from Middle Eastern countries, unfortunately, currently, especially after the Hamas attack to Israel, Middle East's perception toward the US is very bad. Why, US supported Ukraine, but and also at the same time to just Israel. I mean, human rights is very important for Biden's administration, but so far, of course, currently inside US, very divided. But even though most majority is that to support Israel, so this is kind of unbalanced between Ukraine and Gaza. So that's its one point. And during 20 years, I think after September 11th, 2001, and Iraqi War 2003, I think US policy toward Middle East has been, so strictly say that failed, or even for now. So that's why, trust from Middle East countries on Washington is really decreasing now. So this is a point, so which we have to discuss today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for waiting. Mr. Gray, it's your turn.
Well, thank you again for having given me the opportunity to speak to this group. I echo most of what my fellow panelists said. I would just add a couple of additional points. I think it was Mr. Emmott who said that really the priority for 2024 is making sure that Ukraine is not seen to be defeated. And I couldn't agree more. And I think everything else that we're dealing with when we think about other areas of conflict and the additional parts of this global challenge that we're facing really depends, for a number of reasons, on Ukraine not being seen to succumb to territorial aggression. Not only does that have a direct impact on the success of the continuation of the post-1945 world order, but it's going to have very practical effects. And we've seen since the invasion 2 years ago, autocracies or illiberal states around the world showing more and more of a willingness to use force to get their way in territorial disputes. Really, we all know the foundation of the post-1945 world order is the peaceful settlement of dispute resolution, of this territorial dispute resolution. If we are seen to allow Moscow to be successful in changing Ukraine's borders by force, we have essentially acquiesced to the destruction of the key pillar of that order. And we're already seeing whether it's Venezuela threatening Guyana in the Western Hemisphere, whether it's Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Caucasus, whether it's talk about potential territorial changes by force in West Africa. We're seeing again and again the breakdown of that order and the breakdown of key principles of that order. I think that's going to be the key task of 2022 at a macro level, is keeping Ukraine going and hopefully getting to victory as we think about how to succeed in this area. If we have to be more specific, and I think we should be, about the biggest challenge of 2024 in that way of thinking, to me it's this: it's domestic fatigue. Primarily, it's domestic fatigue in the United States. I understand there's obviously domestic fatigue towards aiding Ukraine in Western Europe and in the EU, but the United States is particularly experiencing what really we have a cyclical history of turning inward after periods of great overseas exertion. And we're entering one of those cyclical periods, and we have been for several years now. And the challenge that the United States has and our political leadership has is to make the case that there is a fundamental American interest, and an interest that affects all Americans, regardless of political affiliation, in ensuring that post-1945 order stands, and therefore that Ukraine is able to hold on. Unfortunately, I think usually when Americans are called to some great exertion, our leadership in Washington rally them through speeches. We see presidents speaking from the Oval Office. There are great examples of presidential rhetoric trying to rally the American people. Congress, on a bipartisan basis, will often rally. We haven't seen that in Ukraine. We haven't seen the type of national leadership across parties that we usually see when we're asking Americans to do something difficult. And to me, that's a huge challenge. And that's been one of the reasons I think that we're seeing the American people turning inward and against this exertion, is they haven't been rallied to undertake a great task. I would also say one of the challenges that we're dealing with in this question is, we talked about compartmentalization, or I mentioned this in a previous panel, the idea that traditionally when we have threats to the United States, our leadership in Washington can look at them discreetly, and we can say, this is how we handle China, this is how we handle Iran, this is how we handle North Korea. Because we have this unprecedented level of cooperation between what I think is rightly being called an axis of autocracies, whether it's North Korea sending artillery shells to kill innocent Ukrainians, whether it's China doing dual-use technology that's benefiting Russia and Ukraine, whether it's China buying oil against sanctions to keep Russia's economy afloat and its industrial base afloat, whether it's Iran sending Shahed drones to kill innocent Ukrainians. All of this is one problem in some sense. These are all interconnected, and American policymakers and the American public are not used to operating this way. We've had almost 30 years post-Cold War of being able, because of our overwhelming strength and our overwhelming resources, to treat problems discreetly. And we've lost that privilege now. And so I think this is going to require a whole new mental framework for American leaders to address an unprecedented level of cooperation by our adversaries. And I would also agree with Dr. Schwarzer on her point about just the strain on policymakers. I worked at the National Security Council, which was the locus of the President of the United States' decision-making on all national security issues. We never had more than 250 people on that staff. You're now asking 250 people essentially to manage 3 or 4, depending on how you count, interlocking crises all around the world with a level of national exertion that we haven't had to expend in a very long time. That's going to have a significant impact on the practical effects of meeting this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. although I think we have many questions already, I'd like to get back to one compartmentalized issue of Ukraine and then spread from there. So I would like to ask Dr. Schwarzer about, you have a very interesting piece in Project Syndicate asking, will Europe ever get serious about defense? And while I leave everybody to read the piece, instead of asking you to elaborate on that, we do see 2 years since Chancellor Scholz's turning point speech, that we see that, and Germany has been the second largest supplier of military aid to Ukraine. At the same time, we just heard in recent news that there is still reluctance to send Taurus long-range missiles to Ukraine. And we talked about this a bit in yesterday's session, but do you think they're domestically, Mr. Gray just talked about domestic fatigue, is it more about the fear of escalation, or is it more about fatigue of the issue? And you talk about domestic politics in Germany. Can you give us a sense of where you are in terms of the turning point, where you are? And is this, what you said about the crisis going forward, is it leading to more further step towards the turning point, or are the forces pulling Germany behind or more reluctant or more careful? Is this still very strong?
Thank you very much. So for 2 years after the turning point speech, I think we can really see a fundamental shift of Germany's defense policy, its support for Ukraine, financially, militarily, then in particular the first phase of the war, very quickly in humanitarian ways, refugees coming to Europe and so on. So there's a clear commitment and a very clear understanding what is at stake, and that what is at stake is not only about Ukraine and not only about Europe, but essentially about world order, as we just discussed this. So this is pretty much acknowledged in Berlin. Now, you asked 2 questions with regards to the military support, and you gave options. Is it the fear of escalation, or is it a fatigue in society that there's reluctance on certain arms deliveries? And I would say for the most recent debate on the Taurus missiles, it is indeed the fear of escalation. And more generally, we see within society that, of course, now 2 years into the war, there are questions with regards to how much more this will cost, what the trade-offs are, and so on. But we still see a majority of Germans in opinion polls support ongoing support for Ukraine. So that's good news. However, what it takes in the situation is ongoing political leadership and reframing why this is so important, and explaining it again and again. This brings me to the European dimension. What we have seen over the past days with big statements from France about ground troops, then immediate denial from others, criticism of Germany not delivering the Taurus missiles, and then an explanation by the Chancellor. This doesn't look good in terms of European unity. And I do believe, and that's in my piece, which you quoted, that Europeans missed a moment at the Munich Security Conference to actually show how much they do and give guidance of what they are willing to do together. Now, just before the start of the Munich Security Conference on that same day, Germany signed a long-term agreement with Ukraine on support for 10 years, and so did France that same afternoon. The UK did so before. So here we have the 3 major military players in Europe, and Poland is continuously supporting Ukraine as well, who all do a lot. But what we need to do much better is, first of all, coordinating this, becoming far more efficient in defense cooperation. Procurement, for instance, is a big issue, and the development of a European armament industry, which right now is becoming a central issue. And at the same time, the political guidance and signaling that Europe is determined to sustain this has an important significance, both outward looking, but also within societies. You asked whether this will the support go away? Despite everything I've said about a lack of coordination and not so coordinated messaging, I would say that the government in Germany, as it is in Poland, France, and other places, is very determined to move ahead and to support Ukraine, because the costs of letting Ukraine fail are enormous. And of course, as you know, the closer you get in terms of geographical proximity, the clearer this message is. If you talk to Polish leaders, to Baltic leaders, they are extremely clear and committed. And we really, in the EU of 27, should not neglect the small member states. Although in absolute terms, of course, they give less to Ukraine. But if you look at the share of GDP they give in support, this is very high. And so there you see, I think, as an indicator how seriously this whole situation is taken.
Thank you. Sticking to the question of who pays for this, I'd like to turn my question to Mr. Gray. I believe that one of the big shocks among European countries recently was President Trump suggesting that he would encourage Russia to do whatever they want to member states he views as not spending enough on their defense. And also, I think what you mentioned the importance, or you emphasized the importance of Ukraine should not be defeated. At the same time, the 60 billion military aid may not pass Congress after opposition from some Republicans in conference. So what do you see as a domestic debate in the US, given your stated importance of the Ukraine conflict? And also, the second part of my question is, what is your view of some arguments that are made that maybe the US should prioritize Taiwan over Ukraine? And that Dr. Schwarzer talked about the cost and resources. Do you think that the US needs to prioritize one region or the other, and possibly prioritize Asia over Ukraine? So 2 questions. What is the domestic situation regarding the support for Ukraine, and should there be some prioritization? Thanks.
Thank you. So on the first question of the U.S. debate, I think the U.S. debate on Ukraine is really boils down to fatigue of 20 years of military adventures abroad. And Iraq, Afghanistan, we all understand that we're not asking U.S. troops to directly intervene in Ukraine. That's not even on the table. But the American people are just fatigued. They're fatigued with, as I said, 20 plus years of overseas intervention. And again, we have cyclical, we have a history of this. We have cycles in American politics, particularly in the Republican Party, where we revert inward, particularly after large scale overseas endeavors. And, you know, the debate, as I see it, is really between those who are looking at the challenge that we face between this axis of autocracies and who see that as a global challenge to hard, tangible American interests, both economic and strategic, and those who, I think, reflect the American people's sense of fatigue and sense of overtaxation, not in the literal sense, but being overtaxed in terms of our obligations abroad. I tend to believe, you know, without going into too much congressional procedure and putting on my old congressional staffer hat, I think eventually we will get something through the House of Representatives supporting Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. It will be less than Ukraine certainly needs, and it will be less than Taiwan certainly needs. But I think something will come out over the next several weeks, would be my tentative prediction, that President Biden will be able to support, and we will be able to at least not turn off the spigot in the immediate term for aid to Ukraine. That's certainly my hope, and I think my reading of the tea leaves is that we'll get there. You know, I think as a longer term issue over the next year and 2 years, those who favor support for Ukraine are going to have to make a strategic case. And this goes to your second question. We are hearing this debate, and very close friends of mine in the policy community in Washington are compellingly, I think, making an argument that we have to prioritize Taiwan over Ukraine. This is an issue I disagree with those analysts on, and I think this is something that we're going to have, those who advocate for Ukraine are going to have to actually turn this debate on its head. If you want to support Taiwan, if you want to support a stable military balance in the Indo-Pacific, then you need to be making the case that Ukraine cannot fail. you need to be making the case that if Ukraine fails, that not only does that wreak havoc on the international order, as I said earlier, predicated on territorial expansion not being acceptable by force, but it also will be a direct signal to the Chinese Communist Party that the Taiwan Straits is open for business. And I think it will show, I think we've already seen a tremendous failure of deterrence over the last 3 years, whether it's the Red Sea, whether it is Ukraine, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's the Korean Peninsula. Deterrence is eroding globally. And so I think those in favor of support for a robust American presence in the Indo-Pacific should actually be arguing first and foremost that if we're ever, what's the point of prioritizing in the Indo-Pacific if the foundational order has been undermined by our failure to aid Ukraine successfully? You can have as much military power repositioned to the Indo-Pacific as you want, but if that fundamental order has collapsed because of we are perceived to have allowed deterrence to fail in Ukraine, an extra carrier battle group doesn't do you very much good. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to turn the question now to Mr. Emmott. I understand that you have a book coming out titled Deterrence, Diplomacy, and Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. So we were just talking about Taiwan. Can you respond or add to what Mr. Gray had to say? Thank you.
Well, I would say, I mean, first of all, thank you for mentioning the forthcoming book, which will be published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, but also there's going to be a Japanese version as well by Fuzosha Publishing, but that'll be in the summer. My basic response is simple. I agree 100% with what Alex Gray just said. I think that there is not really a serious question of whether resources should be prioritized between Asia and Europe. This is one strategic space, and if Ukraine is allowed to be defeated, then essentially this acts as a green light, as he said, for Taiwan. My second point is that really the big issue of deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is not specifically one about resources. I don't think Taiwan and its own defense even is really constrained by resources. Taiwan doesn't need American grants of resources. Taiwan is a wealthy country. It has a very low public debt. It can buy the weapons that it needs. It really is not in the same condition as Ukraine and is not fighting a war. There is not a serious constraint on resources in Asia. The real issue in the Indo-Pacific is credibility and political will. And the credibility question is essentially the credibility of the promise that if an attempt was made to invade or blockade Taiwan to force reunification through coercion, that America and Japan and other allies would engage in a conventional warfare to prevent that. If that message is credible, I think we've got a very good chance of avoiding an invasion or other form of coercion over Taiwan. If it does not look credible, then I think the risks of conflict over Taiwan are high. What could make that not credible? Well, of course, a lack of American spending on defense could do so. But like Alex Gray, I don't think it's a matter of carrier strike groups. It's mainly a matter of positioning of forces. It's mainly a matter of availability of forces in the region to quickly intervene and raise the costs of an attempted invasion. But above all, it's the political will in Washington, D.C., and the political will in Tokyo, and the political will in Sydney, and the political will in London and other European capitals. And the demonstration of a consistent political will that credibly says we would take part in a conventional conflict over Taiwan if you attempt one, that is what will stand the best chance of succeeding in deterrence in the way that, as Alex Gray said, we've failed in so many other occasions. That threat of essentially fighting a conventional war directly with China then does carry nuclear implications, because in Ukraine we do not have a direct conventional conflict between nuclear powers. But if we were to be in a conventional conflict with China over its attempted invasion of Taiwan, this would be a conventional war between nuclear powers, which is precisely what we never had during the Cold War, thanks to the myriad of arms control understandings, but also an acceptance of what the devastating risks were that would be involved with a conflict directly between the Soviet Union and the United States and the rest of the West. So I think that our chances of preventing this euphemistically called Taiwan contingency, by which we mean an invasion of Taiwan, really rests on the credibility of our willingness to threaten conventional intervention, but then that does carry a very clear implication that we accept that this could be something that will escalate to the nuclear level. And of course, there is a huge imbalance in nuclear forces between the United States and China. And we have to embrace the fact that nuclear forces are going to have to be back in the dialogue around peacekeeping in the Indo-Pacific, in my view.
Thank you. So since we've covered the first front and a possible worry, concern over the third front, we'll like to come back to the second front, or about the Middle East. Today, I think we're very fortunate to have two former government officials who work on Middle East policy quite closely. So I'd like to first talk to Mr. Nakagawa. How do the countries in the Middle East see the other fronts in the world, basically? Or how do they see where Europe and the US is on other fronts, and how do they think that impacts the policy towards the Middle East?
Okay, thank you very much. And regarding the first point which I made, I missed 2 points, very important points. Firstly, in 2013, at the Syrian crisis, when Syrian President Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons, at that time, Obama's administration, did not attack to Syria, and though it was a red line. And then he said, the US is not the world's policeman. This is really, impact, influence on not just the Middle East, and it's kind of the change of the world order. Because next year, 2014, President Putin decided to invade to Crimea, right? And then, as Mr. Great said, that 2021 August, Biden administration decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. But maybe you remember, this is a really, sorry to say, very, failing. I cannot say, successful. So that's why those two events, especially Middle Eastern countries, consider as weakness from Washington. They do not want to, use by force. In the Middle Eastern countries, unfortunately, force is the strongest way. So soft power, of course, from the Middle, European and Western countries' point of view, we have to, of course, rule of law, soft power. But unfortunately, still, Middle East is force is the best way to make deterrence. So that's point. So I think this is really this statement major change of the world order, not just to the Middle East. This is the first point. And second point is China's influence. I have to mention that last year, as I said in the beginning, 3 countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, China, mediated the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to restore the diplomatic channels. It means that because, during 20 years after Iraqi war, U.S. policy toward the Middle East has been, decreasing, and shift from the Middle East, pivot to Asia. This is firstly occurred under Obama's administration, and also I think that even Biden's administration, in the first speech, 2021 February, in the State Department, that President Biden emphasized on China and Russia as a competitor, but they didn't mention even Israel alliance. They didn't mention Iran. They just mentioned Yemen's issue as a human crisis. So those kind of, really, diversifies the US policy stemmed from the Middle East. This is the point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Gray, I understand that during the Trump administration, you worked on this policy too. So, how would you evaluate the current Biden administration's handling of the situation? And also, how different would a possible Trump administration be on this issue? Thank you.
Well, I obviously want to make clear I don't speak for President Trump and I don't speak for his campaign. But what I can do is look back as someone who witnessed how he governed for 4 years and maybe make some extrapolations for what that might look like in the future. When President Biden came into office, he immediately made a statement. Well, actually, during his campaign, he made some statements against the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and was very clear about reorienting his approach to the Gulf Arab states in a way that prioritized certain American perceptions of human rights issues and placed strategic issues and economic issues on a lower tier. He was very public about that. When he came into office, that clearly had a substantial impact, along with his early decision to delist the Houthis from the terrorist State Department list of terrorist groups. All of that had a very deleterious impact on U.S. relations with the Gulf Arab countries. If we think about this in linkage and we think about not compartmentalizing, one thing that has been obvious over the last 3 years, the Middle East is not separate somehow from great power competition as well. China is growing its presence in the Middle East, and most concerning, the Gulf Arab states, in many cases, are embracing China as a counterweight to what they see to be an absent or retreating America. We're seeing Iran obviously projecting its proxy groups all over the region, and a failure of deterrence, which I think, again, going back to our global take on this, a failure of deterrence that is partially attributable to American failures in other parts of the world. So I think if we extrapolate the differences between that situation and how things operated from 2017 to 2021, we saw President Trump operating from a position of deterrence and hard power strength, but also very aggressive negotiations that allowed the United States, take Israel, for example. President I think he domestically, in American domestic politics, would talk about being the best friend of Israel that Israel's ever had in the White House. But one of the things that permitted him to do was to extract concessions from Prime Minister Netanyahu that he was then able to use to gain leverage in the negotiations that landed the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were an extraordinary success in terms of allowing a more stable equilibrium in the Middle East. And also, I would argue, if we're thinking about this from a global perspective, keeping great power competitors out of the Middle East and allowing the Middle East to operate on a more stable footing long term. I think if we look at that template for what might happen in a second Trump term, I think we will see additional deterrence capabilities brought to bear in the region. I think we're going to see the president focus on expanding the Abraham Accords. I think you'll see very quick overtures to Saudi Arabia. I know there were public reports that before October 7th, Saudi Arabia was prepared to enter into the Abraham Accords. I think you're going to see that. I think you'll see a U.S. defense pact with Saudi Arabia, which would do much to keep out any incentive for Riyadh to make additional arrangements with the Chinese. So I think you're going to see a much more strategic approach to the Middle East that's based on deterrence and based on building long-term alliances with the Gulf Arab states that are going to be able to produce a more, I would argue, more stable region. Thank you.
Thank you. For a perspective from Europe, I'd like to first turn to Mr. Emmott and then to Dr. Schwarzer on this issue. So how do you view going forward how the very difficult issue of the Gaza and also the larger Middle East situation will evolve, given that there's multiple conflicts happening at different fronts in the world. So first, Mr. Emmott first.
Thank you. Well, I suppose the way I view it is that the essential task in this Middle East conflict that's going on is to organize and benefit from the direct intervention of regional powers, which includes the Gulf countries, includes Egypt, clearly above all Saudi Arabia. And the key question is, can you mobilize these regional powers to act as a containing force, both on Israel and on Hamas, and as containing forces to make it likelier that the ultimate, more peaceful resolution of this is sustainable. I think that the question with the way the Biden administration has run it is a question of too much, perhaps, military support for Israel as the invasion of Gaza has gone on, which has obviously been quite against the views of many people in the Gulf. But on the other hand, I think that the Biden administration has been pretty successful at involving Gulf countries and Egypt in the negotiations, putting pressure on all sides. There is, in effect, a contact group approach being done. The regional powers are willing to take part, with the huge exception of Iran, who are, of course, parties to the conflict by proxy, at least. But the Gulf countries, Saudi and the Gulf states, Qatar, especially as well, and Egypt are very much part of the process that's leading to the, I think, imminent ceasefire, and then will be part of the very important process. The big test, I think, for American policy currently will be about building on that ceasefire to then try to start to shape a dialogue about the future of Gaza and indeed the future of Palestine. And if the regional powers are not involved in that, then this would be an unsustainable outcome. If they can be involved in that, which they currently are, then I think from a European point of view, this could look like it becomes a sustainable way to solve the problem. And I do think that the Abraham Accords and the initiatives that the Trump administration did in that regard were very positive and have been a positive background to getting the regional powers involved in this conflict, much as they would prefer not to have to be involved. And now the Biden administration, I think, is building on that and seeking to build on that. From a European point of view, we see ourselves as bystanders. And that is a great European failure, that essentially we have no real role or influence in the Middle East. It's our backyard, but basically we have no salience in this conflict. We just give speeches from the sidelines, like football supporters shouting against one side and in favor of the other. So I think the European perspective is that we're impotent in the Middle East, but our analysis is that actually the regional contact group approach involving the Gulf countries, involving Egypt in the resolution and containment of this conflict is the absolutely vital route to take towards at least containing, but then hopefully moving towards some kind of sustainable solution.
Thank you. Dr. Schwarzer, you mentioned in the opening statement that we're talking about the challenges, and it's a matter not just of cost, but also order and values. And I think this Middle East issue has something to do with that. So what is your take on this?
Yeah, thank you very much. So unfortunately, I cannot disagree with Bill Emmott's assessment of Europe's role that it currently takes. I mean, what we saw is a big diplomatic effort, at least, if you look at what Germany did. 5 visits since October 7th by our foreign minister. And firstly, Israel was very much in the focus after the terrorist attacks of Hamas. But then more and more countries have been visited, and there was a sustained diplomatic effort. However, again, the coordination among Europeans isn't at its best. And what we see is that indeed within societies there are divisions over how to position oneself in the conflict vis-a-vis Israel and the Muslim states in the region. So I think there is a clear task for Europe, in particular if, you know, as the elections are coming up in the US, there might be less of an effort on the US side, and we don't really know, although I listened very closely about the analysis, what a Trump presidency could mean for the Middle East. But it is true that there's a strong imbalance between Europe's impact in a conflict which, in terms of geographical proximity, is very close, and the fear of an escalation of the conflict, of a spreading, and then with all the consequences that Europe would feel very immediately, for instance, if there were new migration flows and so on. I think there is scope to get even more involved and to try and further a regional solution, which can only, in my view, also be built with the parties involved that have been mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're at the 4:30 mark, and as I promised, I'd like to turn to questions, but we didn't quite talk about the Asia part, so I'm going to pick up one question from the internet audience, and to place that as a question to you to add a little bit more about the Asian situation. So I think the question is, in order to prevent hot contingency in Taiwan, we need a regional security framework like NATO in the Indo-Pacific, or the person who asked the question believes that. What is your take on a possible network type security arrangements in NATO, and what is necessary to do that? And is that possible? And how exactly would your country be involved? So can I turn to you, Mr. Gray, first about, like, do you think there should be a NATO in Asia or NATO type thing in Asia?
So I don't think we need an Asian NATO with a secretariat and a secretary general and all the trappings. I think what we need is to continue to grow the existing security architectures that we have, whether it's the Quad or Quad Plus or the trilateral US, Japan, South Korea, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's the Pacific Islands Forum, whether it's on the defense side, things like AUKUS, the US security treaties that we have with Thailand, the Philippines, Japan, Korea, Australia. All of those are security frameworks that can be expanded and built upon. They're also nimble. They can flex up and down depending on the situation at hand. The Quad is a great example where you can have this Quad Plus idea of adding additional countries to participate in various dialogues within the Quad based on what the issue at hand happens to be. I think a NATO architecture in Asia, one, creates too much unnecessary structure and too much unnecessary handcuffs on what really is a fluid security environment where, let's be honest, most countries in the region have very complex relationships with China, and most countries in the region have substantial economic relationships at the same time that they have very real security concerns. Having a security architecture, like I just outlined, that we've had in different forms for decades, I think is nuanced enough to take into account that most Asian countries are not going to be able to position themselves purely on one side of a security of a NATO, Pacific NATO, or the other. And we need that level, frankly, of strategic ambiguity, to use a famous phrase, if we're going to be successful in establishing deterrence across the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. If I were to tag on a question, we didn't really talk about NATO and the Indo-Pacific, or Germany and Indo-Pacific. So, Dr. Schwarzer, you mentioned to me that you were here in Japan last year quite a bit, and there was discussions about the liaison office of NATO in Japan, possibly, and people must have asked you about that. So do you have your thoughts about that issue? Like, how do you think Japan should be working with NATO, and how do you evaluate the situation right now?
Yeah, I think there's a two-way track here. One is obviously Japan's relationship with NATO, and I think the closer the context can be, the better. I mean, the support that Japan has consistently provided for Ukraine, and also small countries like the Republic of Moldova, in terms of, you know, financial support mostly in that case, it is quite striking how, from Japan's perspective, there is a real stake in Europe's security. And obviously NATO, from a European perspective, is the arena, the alliance within which we think about our security. But the big realization over the past 2 years, I would say, from a European perspective, is how closely the security arenas in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe are interlinked. And in my 5 points, I think I made that case that it goes both ways, and that there is a real interest to bring the coordination between the like-minded countries that not only want to play a positive role in conflict prevention and conflict handling, but also in sustaining a rules-based international order. The more we can do, the better. And I think there's one thing we shouldn't forget, and I don't think we mentioned it so much over the past day. The role of China in pushing for a redesign of global order is quite strong. We see it through the UN agencies, we see it through conceptual papers. I very much remember the Russian-Chinese paper before the war in Ukraine was started by Russia, and there you see a clear will to redesign structures of global order. And I think we need to take that very seriously, go into a dialogue, but also among those like-minded countries which want to protect the rules and norms that the order is currently based on. I think that is an important task in addition to the conflict management, which we have spoken about.
Thank you. So now I'd like to open the floor for the questions. So Professor Ishii, please identify yourself before you ask the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Hikotani-san. My name is Ishii. I'm a retired diplomat. My question goes to Alex. Whenever I hear the domestic fatigue, overseas fatigue, I feel really uneasy and concerned. Simply because my question is it going to be, in the long run, applied to bilateral alliance like Japan and ROK in Asia, considering that President Trump was about to withdraw the USFK a few years ago? So, and follow-up question, if it's different, if it's not, answer is no, why not? The question is, how is it different from Ukraine? That's my question. And to ask it from a different angle is, what should we do in the region, Japan, ROK, and maybe NATO countries, to make sure that this fatigue is not going to infiltrate it into the more important alliances? Thank you.
It's a critical question, and I don't think there's anything that our allies and partners need to be doing. I think it's a question for American policymakers. As I said, I think the fundamental problem with the Ukraine fatigue issue is the American people have not been rallied to understand why Ukraine is in their interests. We have to, if you look at the public opinion research and you see how Americans view different security commitments, what you're seeing over a 10-year period is, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's NATO, that support for meeting our longstanding security commitments across all segments of Americans, all demographics, is decreasing. And so we have to have a concerted effort in Washington, and I'm from the president on down, whoever that is, to make the case for why this isn't about, and I may offend some people in this room, and I think you've heard me talk in this panel and the previous one about my support for the liberal international order, but that language does not resonate with most Americans. We have to be very strategic in how we make the case that these security relationships are in the fundamental interests of the average American. I think that that is a case we can make. We can make it for economic reasons. We can make it for strategic reasons. We can make it for reasons of homeland defense. But I think once we start talking about liberal internationalism, liberal democratic order, rules-based order, those things are amorphous to the average American. They don't mean anything. And they frankly, after Iraq and Afghanistan, they've lost a lot of their credibility. And so I think as we're thinking about making this case from Washington, we need to be very, very judicious with the language that we're using if we're going to expect these security alliances to have broad public support for decades to come. Thank you.
Justin Bassey from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Great panel, really well spoken, all of you. Might be a comment if you haven't been able to get across it, and mainly potentially for Dr. Schwarzer. But flowing on from the question and answer from Alex, where we often ask, we're always asking what more can the Americans do and how can we get the Americans to fight on three fronts. In my mind, the answer is that we've got to show that we are willing to carry the load ourselves. And if we don't, then that risks American public saying, why would we do more? And it risks the politicians. So overnight, it seems that the Europeans, the EU, has rejected what is known as the supply chain due diligence bill, with Germany, France, and Italy seemingly rejecting due diligence being given to investments and contracting with Chinese effectively organizations that might be involved in modern slavery, including through China. So if we have the likes of Germany, France, and Italy saying that not even willing to join the US and other countries in countering threats worldwide in this part of the world, then I think it does it not run the greater risk that the US says, well, we're going to leave you to it.
Thank you. Would anybody like to respond?
Yes, I agree with you. And I would just quote another example, which goes in the same direction. Unless Europeans make a bigger contribution to NATO, it will be very hard to explain to the US public that it's in their interest to sustain the alliance. And, you know, we don't only have to do this in order to keep an American buy-in, but we really need to do it for ourselves. And that discussion is somewhat present in Europe, but we need to be far clearer about our own interests, about our own investment. And yes, there's a huge burden upon us, and it's going to grow. And we're not used to this. I mean, the story in Germany of going to 2% of GDP in terms of defense budget was huge, and we may need to go beyond, you know, maybe 3%. Poland is at 4%. So there are trade-offs to be made, but we do need to understand that it is caring for our own security and caring for the security of our allies and partners. And the US is one, you know, geography we need to look towards, but Asia, as we just discussed, is another. And I do think there are learnings to take from Asian country support for Ukraine, which is essentially a European conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more last question, please.
My name is Shikata, Mitsubishi Company Limited Company Fellow. Let me ask Mr. Gray about the nuclear strategic ambiguity. As I understand, that Richard Haass wrote to Foreign Affairs that the United States should abandon strategic ambiguity. There are a lot of repercussions, and there seems to be an argument in the United States if the United States should maintain such a strategic ambiguity. But in case of Taiwan contingency, it is likely that China is going to exert nuclear coercion over Taiwan, US, and US allies. So it seems to be that the time will come that the United States will abandon such a strategic ambiguity and extend the nuclear umbrella on Taiwan. What is your opinion? Thank you.
Well, as a general matter, I think deterrence works best when it's made clear what your intentions are. And I think we have historical examples galore of failures of deterrence that are generated by misperceptions. One of my biggest concerns, I mentioned this in the previous panel, is that China will underestimate American inherent strength and make a serious miscalculation in Taiwan because they're looking at our domestic politics, because they're looking at very superficial examples of American decline, so to speak, and they'll misunderstand that there are tremendous reservoirs of American power that can be brought to bear when there is a national consensus to use them. And so I worry if we do not speak clearly, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's our NATO commitments, whether it's other things, if we aren't clear about our willingness to use force in peacetime, I worry that we will have miscalculations that erode deterrence in ways that we don't need it eroded. So I guess that's a backwards way of supporting an end to strategic ambiguity. I think if we could get there, that would be ideal. But look, just briefly where we are, I think, in the United States as a practical matter, we are probably in the most strategically ambiguous position on Taiwan than we've ever been in, because President Biden attempted to, in some ways, jettison strategic ambiguity, and his staff 3 separate times countermanded what he said. So I think we ended up actually in a more strategically ambiguous situation than when the president started. I would like to see, whoever is president, a firm statement of America's intention to uphold, going back to the phrase I just denigrated, the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And part of that is ensuring that the Chinese Communist Party understands that going across the strait would be absolutely catastrophic for them.
Hi, so I'd like to turn to Mr. Emmott now for actually the last word. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be brief. I just want to introduce an element of disagreement with Alex Gray, with whom I've agreed on almost everything so far. But I don't agree that President Biden's position on Taiwan reinforced ambiguity. I think that he stated 4 times that America would intervene. His staff clarified only that this did not represent a change from the One China policy and the historic communiques agreements between America and China and America and Taiwan. They did not clarify, as it were, that this was still ambiguity. What he has done, which actually George W. Bush did as well more than 20 years ago, is to move away from strategic ambiguity. And I absolutely think that this is critical, that he and future presidents, whoever they may be, maintain this position of strategic clarity concerning the fact that America would send its troops to defend Taiwan in the case of a coercion. And I think that they have added to the credibility by adjusting the force posture in ways that have been important, that I don't think that China doubts American clarity. I think if you really got somebody from the PLA or from Xi Jinping's office, I don't think that they think that America's position is ambiguous. But also, the key thing is Japan and Japan's own defense build-up, but also its adjustment of its own force posture into the Nansei Islands to reinforce the credibility of Western deterrence, and that Japan-US relationship is critical. I just leave it there.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I would like to ask you to join me in a round of applause to the terrific, wonderful panelists today for a very good discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion.